All right. Welcome to the podcast. I got a great one for you today. I've got Walt Settlemyer joining me. He's a U.S. Army veteran. He's a career paramedic. He's also a defensive tactics instructor with certifications in both Gracie survival tactics and the spear system. Shout out to Tony Blair, friend of the podcast. He's also the host of the Distinguished Savage podcast. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. I've been following this guy for a while. I've been watching the content he puts out. It's great stuff. It inspires me. It lights me up. So Walt, welcome to the podcast, my man.
Man, I appreciate that's a very nice intro, man. I appreciate it. I hope I can live up to that. Jesus.
No, for sure. I say your last name right. I want to make sure that I did.
Yeah, Settlemyer. Yeah,
Settlemyer.
It's just had a weird spelling. Yeah.
Old
Austrian German name.
Yeah. Well, you're out there, you're out in Austin, Texas. Is that correct?
Yeah. Just I work in Austin. I live just outside of Austin in Hayes County, but it's close enough for government work, as we say.
There you go.
Because everything is sort of like outside of Austin. It's but Austin's a huge town, though. It's just a large, spread out town. Not like most cities where where everything's sort of in your area. You got to drive to everything there. It's crazy.
Yeah, I've been to Austin 2 or 3 times. I can't help but make the parallel about what's happening in Austin to what's happening in Boise, Idaho as well. I'm out here in Idaho, man. We've got a lot of new neighbors that are flocking into our town for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that. Because Idaho, it's so funny. Like, it used to be like, oh, Idaho's flat, or it's, but I mean, it's gorgeous. And I think people are discovering that now, and discovering like, the amazing, just the outdoor stuff that you can do there, and how beautiful the scenery is, man. And like, same thing with here, man. People are moving there in droves.
I love it. Hey, man, I love the name of your ecosystem. The whole Distinguished podcast thing. You got one of the best logos out there. I'd love to hear a little bit about that logo as well. But yeah, apparel and this whole thing. Where does the whole Distinguished Savage thing come from?
Man, it comes from a couple of different places. So first and foremost, I mean, you're seeing me now, but if people haven't seen me, I sort of look like a meathead, shaved head, tattoos, sure. And sort of muscular. I'd like to think so anyway, right? Because I try to get after it. But it came from a couple of different places. I used to work in men's retail, and like high-end men's retail. I worked on Rodeo Drive for a while for it was a company called Ixies, which I don't think is around anymore, and then Bernini, which I think is still around, but they carried a lot of different lines. I just dug clothes, right? I like to dress well, like to wrap the package well, so to speak. So I kind of got into that when I was a little bit younger, and as I grew older, started trying to do different jobs. I had a myriad of jobs before I kind of settled into fire and EMS. So I was always looking for that thing that I wanted to do. So that dressing well, sort of wrap the package thing was a big part of it. And then the savage aspect of it was like, ex-military or former military, however we probably say it. But I was into like, guns, knives. I can talk as passionately about, a well-made suit as I can about, a nice sidearm or a really well-made blade. And so it's just sort of like all sort of congealed together into this Distinguished Savage. So that's kind of what the thought process was.
I can see it now. Just you, walking by like Tiffany's on Rodeo Drive, like reading a knife magazine.
Right.
Yeah, man. Well, I think dichotomies are beautiful, man. I think that we don't necessarily tend to think of savagery or things that are maybe closer to tactical slash combatives in the same respect as we do dressing dapper and being really aware of your personal presentation.
Yeah, exactly. And it was tough when I was kind of suss out the initial sort of thought process on the podcast. It's not necessarily always like, you're not always wearing a suit, you're always wearing a sport coat, but like whatever you wear, dress. I think sort of the tagline is, I use it occasionally as, dress like you mean business, whatever that business may be. You see a lot of dudes going out in like pajama pants and Crocs and some weird t-shirt, or something, and I'm like, hey man, dress like you give a fuck about yourself. You're presenting a picture when you go out. You're presenting this image, and you want people to take you seriously, or do you want people to look at you more like, all right, who's this yahoo, right? So,
and I think there's an important vein there too, because I've dismissed that perspective, like admittedly in the past. Like it's been one of those things where it's like, sometimes I'm that guy that'll, especially in my 20s, go to Walmart in Crocs and a Holy t-shirt and all that other stuff. But at the same time, I do think there is a lot of personal dignity and taking the time to prepare yourself to go out in the world. And like, it's not about how others perceive you. That's the easy thing to like, oh, I don't care what anyone thinks. But it's like, well, what do you think?
Yeah.
Like, that's important. That's an important thread to pull there. So I'm sure you've got that in your head rattling around as well.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I always sort of looked at it as, you're just thinking from a military point of view. You remember when the first Gulf War kicked off, and you see these guys rolling up in, from the Iraqi side with like sweatpants and a Daddy's Little Princess T-shirt on and flip flops and an AK, and you see U.S. soldiers roll up in full kit. And like, who are you going to be like, okay, this guy means, which one are you going to say this guy means business with? But I extrapolate that to kind of everything. Like if I'm going down to the coast to surf, I look like a surfer, I kind of have that look, that vibe, or if I'm, whatever I'm doing, day to day, like it sort of matches what I'm, if I'm going to the range, I look like I'm going to the range. If I'm going out, I've got a Christmas party tonight for my girlfriend's work, so I'll be wearing like a sport coat and jeans, and I'll be carrying, but I'll, and stretch fabrics are the greatest thing to ever happen to men. So, I don't know. And it's that, so you can be comfortable now. You can be comfortable. There's no excuse anymore. Like guys like, I don't want to wear that monkey suit. I'm like, man, it's so comfortable now. You can dress well,
Well, hey, I was listening to your podcast from maybe it was a couple podcasts ago with Ed Boswell.
Yeah, it's a good dude.
Yeah, interesting cat, man. And I couldn't
help.
Absolutely. And you guys anchored in. You kind of went like, I don't want to say deep, but you're throwing military perspectives back and forth and stories from one another. And you've got a background in the Army. Maybe kind of take me through that. When did you join the Army? When did you get out? And then like, how did that perspective shape this like distinguished savage profile that you've got?
Man, that is I know it's sort of the apropos thing to say, but that is a really good question because no one's ever asked me that before. So I'm an older guy, right? I'll be 57 in January, and hopefully I'm aging pretty well, right? But I grew up in like Western North Carolina, you're right in the foothills of the mountains. And so I sort of grew up with that whole duty, honor, country, because I grew up on TV, like everybody else, John Wayne movies and all that. And I sort of played Army until I grew up and joined the Army. So I enlisted. I went in '83, right out of high school, ETS towards the end of, or intermission of service, towards the end of 87 in December of 87. So about 4.5 years or so. And it was interesting because it really changed my perspective on a lot of things in a lot of ways. Because I went in and, there were guys in there who were like, I know, I had to join the Army. And I'm like, what? You had to? You don't want to be here, And so it was really interesting seeing that perspective, and, being from, I got to travel a little bit because my mom she became an executive with the company she worked for. She was a nurse and worked her way up. So I got to travel a little bit. I had a little bit of exposure, but growing up in smaller town, Western North Carolina, you still have a sort of sheltered view of things. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. It opened my eyes to the idea of like, wow, there's poverty in the world. Like I've seen poverty, but there's poverty in the world. And there's different cultures, and cultures that always fascinated me since I was a kid, especially Asian cultures, especially Japanese. I always had an affinity for that. But it really, what was interesting is when I got out, because it was a much harder adjustment getting out than I thought it would be, because you do have a very regimented life in the military. And I liked that because I was pretty regimented before that, but only on things that interested me. Like if something didn't interest me, I had no discipline whatsoever. But one of the things that I really appreciate the military taught me is like, whatever I'm going to do, I need to have full attention and focus on that. And that's one of the things I appreciate about it. But going to college afterwards, and it was interesting because, I was older then, and I was, I had a little more life skills, I'd like to think, and it was interesting, with all these kids around me younger. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, why aren't you studying? Why aren't you getting your shit together? Why aren't you making things happen here? And it was interesting change for me. And there are parts of me that still miss the military, and then parts of me that don't, because I, a very dichotomous personality in that, sometimes I need authority in my life, but I'm not a big fan of authority in my life. Right. So it's always that dichotomy, that push pull.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. one of the things that I reflect on is I lived a lot of years in my life without discipline. I
Yeah.
would say. I mean, I was, you know, I went through college. I was good at my job, but like when it really came down to like, is this a virtue or value that like I really prescribe to? I think the answer would be no. I would make
Mhm.
promises to myself all the time and then not do those types of things. And then for a period of time in my life, I got really disciplined and I see what the other side of that is. So like
Yeah.
I feel out of balance when I'm not.
Yes.
To your
Yes.
point, when you were walking around looking at other people uh and thinking like, man, why why is it so hard for you to put that stuff together? I can't help but maintain the perspective that if you've had a period in your life in which you've been disciplined, like
Yeah.
that kind of becomes your default of like how you measure yourself. And then
Yeah.
if you've never seen it or done it or felt it, then man, like it's hard to imagine changing your life in that way without kind of that discipline forced on you. And so
Yeah.
I wonder then, how do you synthesize that after you transition? Now, you said it was kind of a rough time. How do you get back to that point of discipline?
Yeah, man. It's the transition wasn't the discipline so much as the camaraderie and the brotherhood that you have.
Oh,
But it is interesting when there's not a lot of other people doing the same things you're doing discipline wise. Like, all right, we're all going to do this. We're all in this suck situation together, And so it's interesting when it becomes just you, because
mm,
you start to realize, or for me anyway, I realize more like, well, look, I've got to be accountable to me. I'm not accountable to a team anymore, which was interesting as a side note, because I sort of drifted around from different jobs and they weren't really team oriented. And what's interesting is I really drifted back into, that was one of the things that really drew me into fire service and EMS later on, was like I missed that camaraderie and that sort of fellowship and brotherhood, and sisterhood in that way, right? Because it's a different relationship in those kinds of jobs, in public safety, military. It's a different relationship with the people. But for as far as the discipline, it's interesting because for a while I still, I would still run, I would still work out, I would still do all those things. And I've always done those things because that's sort of my sanity maintenance, is physical activity, whether it's jujitsu or whether it's any sort of martial art I'm trying to learn, or anything new I'm trying to learn. But it's that discipline aspect was would get dicey, because suddenly you sort of, I think it's kind of like a rum springer. Like you're sort of suddenly like, okay, now I don't have to be anywhere, I don't have to be up, but then you realize like, hey, look, all right, I got to get a job, I'm going to school now, I've got to be places at certain times. And so I sort of rolled back into that. And then sort of I realized how much, it's like you have a little bit of it, there's no sweet without the sour, right? So
ooh,
when I got a
yeah.
little bit of that taste of like doing what I want to do, and I'm like, oh yeah, but I got things I got to accomplish, so I've got to get back on this discipline bandwagon, so to speak. Does that answer
No,
your question?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a broad question anyway, but I'm
Yeah.
curious about how um, discipline manifests in other folks' lives. And I was really
Yeah.
working from the assumption that it was the discipline that faded, but to your point, there was something missing. There was a bigger hole or gap around camaraderie, and I think that was the tough part of the transition. So maybe I was just um,
Yeah,
eager
no,
to
but
attribute it to discipline.
yeah, no, I get that. Because there's that one. It's a lot easier to be, well, not easier necessarily, but I think sometimes it's easier to be disciplined when everyone else is doing the same thing with you. Like whether it's a squad or
Yeah.
small group of guys, whatever you're doing. It's a little bit easier when you're all sort of working towards this team effort, right? And having that discipline to to keep moving or carry on. And then when you're just kind of off to yourself, like suddenly you're sort of just kind of cut free, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh well, and you kind of you do your own kind of your own recognizance, and there's going to be like, just do whatever, and but for me, I don't do well anytime I'm wishy-washy. Anytime I just sort of let things ride or take a scatter, kind of a shotgun approach to something, I don't do well with it, because it's too much ambiguity. And ambiguity, I like ambiguity if I can problem solve it, but if I just let it ride and I ride the fence on anything, whether it's my discipline, whether it's anything, I kind of languish, and I feel off balance.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
No, no, no. Absolutely. So, you said earlier that learning jujitsu, I mean, that's what I use jujitsu for in my life, as an anchor.
Mhm.
If I'm not doing jujitsu, I tend to be off balance for one
I
reason
get
or
that.
another. And that's kind of like my go back to the starting line and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
again build life back around this. How long you been training for? What got you into it?
Man, jujitsu. So it's an on and off, probably about 12, 13-year journey now, right? So because I'll take time off. Like right now, I've been off for a little bit. At first, it was injuries because I was on the special operations team at work with on the rescue side of the house, and I tore the labrum in my right shoulder. So that was initially a little bit of a thing because, and then I came off the rescue team because I'm like, I got to start choosing. I can't just because there's a lot of swimming on the rescue team, right? My ortho is like, I'm like, hey, what can I do? He's like, stop swimming. I'm like, all right. So I just went back to a regular field operations truck, but so it's interesting, man, with jujitsu because I've kind of come in and out. I've gone between different schools. I sort of look for that. I'm always I one of the things I find in my life is I'm always looking for that sort of home base, someplace where I feel like I'm a part of something bigger than myself. And some schools just aren't that, right? And
Yeah.
so I found a great school up north with Sean Cooper School, and now I've migrated down to 10th Planet because no gi is something that I really gravitated towards later on. Even though I wrestled a little bit in high school, mostly for PE. I was horrible
Yeah.
in wrestling. Right? I'd like to think my wrestling's gotten better now, but it's interesting now because I'm on a bit of a hiatus from jujitsu, moving more into like master defense and Filipino martial arts and some of that kind of thing, right? And sort of focusing on that, but I've been really getting this hankering to get back on the mats for jujitsu. I just did Craig Douglas's ECQC class, and there's a lot of Greco-Roman wrestling in that. I'm like,
Yeah.
I got to get back on the mats. I got to get
Well,
back
I
on the
mean,
mats.
Austin, Texas, man, that's blown up for jujitsu, man. It's a
Dude, it's amazing. It is amazing
B teams
how
down
many,
there.
dude. Yeah, B
Gordon
team. I just
Ryan's
met Craig, man.
really
Yeah, man. Yeah, good dude, man. I met him in the oddest way. He is a friend of Alex Jones,
okay.
and I am friends with Alex Jones, head of executive protection.
Okay.
And I've done some training and I teach some classes for him on tactical medicine stuff. And he's like, hey man, we're going to do some shooting out the ranch. I just need somebody medically squared away to come, because folks never shot guns before. And I'm like, yeah, I'll come out there.
Oh, that's so
Right. So
cool.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So it was awesome,
I
man.
saw Alex and Craig's. I follow Craig on Instagram. I saw
Yeah,
this
yeah,
this random like repost with that joke that the father and son kind of
yeah,
thing, like
yeah.
shooting out there. So you were out there with him.
Yeah, I was out there with him, man. Yeah, watching Alex and Craig shoot the Barrett. It was amazing.
Oh, that's killer. That's killer. Yeah, and
Yeah,
then
man.
as far as jujitsu down there in Austin, it's actually a guy named Curtis, 10th Planet.
Yeah,
Um,
Curtis Improv. Yeah, Curtis
yeah,
is a good dude, man.
he went up to Alaska for a couple years.
Yeah, he
I don't
did. He
know
went for a while.
if he's still up there.
No,
But
he's back now. He's back now. He and Gabe are teaching at 10th Planet. That's my home gym now. Is
oh,
10th
great.
Planet, Austin.
So
Yeah.
the
And
town he went up to in Alaska, that's where I'm from. So I
oh,
would
I didn't know
see,
that.
yeah. So I grew up on the Kenai Peninsula, like in Soldotna,
Yeah.
Sterling area. And a lot of people that I went to high school with all of a sudden started posting all these all these photos and Curtis was in some of them. So I started following him. I'm like, man, this is like a super high level jujitsu guy that landed
He
in
is,
this
man.
small town in Alaska. What a gift. So yeah, I imagined he was still, I didn't know that he had got back down, but
Yeah. A couple of 3, maybe 4 months ago, not long ago, he came back down here to Austin.
oh, that's cool, man. So you train folks on a regular basis on firearms. How's that work? Take me
So
through your ecosystem there.
yeah, so I don't train people on firearms per se. My training side of the house is tactical medicine, and then sort of like there's that crossover between with addressing the threat, and being able to apply whether it's a tourniquet to yourself or first aid or buddy first aid to someone else, and still
Mm,
addressing the threat. So there's some of the tactics involved with that a little more. I don't teach shooting per se, right? So that's one of the main things that I teach. Aside from now with work, I teach defensive tactics, whether it's spear and Gracie survival tactics, because I'm a GST 1 level 1 instructor and a spear instructor. So we
yeah.
teach that. I teach situational awareness, and there's a whole sort of a block of information that I give on like pre-fight contact cues or pre-contact cues, however you want to say it, and just sort of anomalies, baselines, sort of things to think about, whether And within the pre-fight contact cue things, you like with it, boiling point physiology, balling the fist, stuff like that. A lot of the situational awareness component of trying to not be in that situation before it goes kinetic is really kind of what I teach.
Yeah. I got to, Tony Blair was teaching a 3-day on site for something called Operation Black Site over the summer.
Oh, nice.
And I had an opportunity to spend at least 2 of those days listening to him, and actually Michael Chandler as well.
Yeah.
Teach some fighting, teach some self-defense, some awareness. Tony's an absolute encyclopedia. And
he is.
And that whole startle flinch thing, the whole splayed hands thing, the whole like the mechanics that he uses that are really simple, like putting on the seatbelt and some of these other things, absolutely shifted my perspective in self-defense. And it actually happened in real time there. And then again, when he came by the podcast to talk about, the creation of the spear system and some of those other things. And I'm sitting there going, man, I probably should do what you're doing, Walt, and go mix in some Filipino striking in these different worlds. Because, if you go too deep in one avenue, you're going to develop this like faux confidence that you can mimic everything that you've learned in a real combative situation. And it's deeper than that. And it's psychological, and it's fast. It's really, really fast, and you have to be ready for it. And so I got to start on that journey sooner than later.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting you say that, because spear is actually what sort of launched me in that journey. Because I've always done like it's been, I mean, for lack of a better term, sport martial arts, whether it was jiu-jitsu, it was boxing, it was Muay Thai. When I was younger, it was karate, but it was always some sort of striking. And then, then later on to jiu-jitsu. And I really, how jiu-jitsu, it puts the hooks in you, because it's just this chess game that you are always trying to solve. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, but what's interesting is sort of like you, I saw spear and I'm like, what is this? I started looking into it and I'm like, that sort of makes sense. I don't know. So I picked up one of the Panteo DVDs from, it's just like the basic spear stuff. I had a training partner who's Andre Thompson, who ended up going to spear with me. And I was also a GST instructor. I'm like, hey man, I want to see if this bullshit or not. Right. And so we started sort of following some of it and I'm like, okay, this really works. Right. And so then I started kind of pitching for, I really took that deep dive into it, because that's just me. I nerd out and I'll go down a rabbit hole and I will just research. And the more I looked into it, I'm like, all right, this is something pretty interesting. So I got a hold of Tony. I'm like, he was super cordial about it too. I'm like, hey, look, I want to get spear here. I'm really interested in this. And what's really interesting is I started adapting some of the spear stuff to even jujitsu, especially if I can catch that outside 90 finger split if someone's trying to slide on the side control, and I can create that space. And I don't know if you do the malfunction drills where you can like reopen that space by grabbing the back of your thumb.
I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. So man, I've started using that, and people are like, hey, what is that? And I'm like, it's just some stuff I don't know. So it's kind of cool when you can kind of incorporate some of that. And then, but two, the thing is, like, I'm not, I'm an older guy, I got a ton of injuries starting with the military, and then powerlifting, and then, jujitsu, and then the job with, working on the special operations team. So I'm not going to ADCC anytime soon, but I am probably going to get in a tussle in the back of the ambulance, or, with a patient or something like that, right? That is a much higher possibility. And so I really took this deep dive into more of defensive tactics and combatives. And man, as far as that is concerned, a lot of the wrestling and the Greco stuff is huge, because you can really maintain that positional control of somebody pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll actually be going to ADCC, but as a spectator.
Nice.
It's funny, man. No, you're absolutely right, man. It's that practical application to the things that you're learning. I mean, you're not going to beer and bolo somebody in an ambulance per se.
Yeah,
that'd be very interesting if that happened. So when did you stand up the podcast, and why'd you do that?
Man, the podcast, I probably, like a lot of guys, I talked about it for 2 years before I actually did it. Right. I'm like, I could do a podcast, because I love, exactly, man. I love podcasts. I'm like, I can talk to people. I'm chatty. Right. And it was way harder than I ever conceived when I first started it. It's been up, I think I put out the 105th or 106th episode just recently. I started it just about 2 years ago. And it's really interesting, because I started it and I had no clue what I was doing. And I listened to those first episodes and I just cringe because
Oh,
I
I did
didn't,
too.
I did. Yeah, man. It's so interesting because suddenly you realize, all right, first and foremost, especially if you're a one-man show like me, like, all right, so now I'm a sound engineer. I'm a sound editor. I got to do the interviewing. I got to like learn how to interview better. I got to learn how to both think and listen at the same time, but be engaged. Right. So I start nerding out on that kind of thing. And it's funny because you start having the conversation and you start to realize like, oh, I'm going to be talking to people I don't know before. So I don't have that, already have that rapport. How can I build that rapport quickly? How can, I increasing my communication skills? But man, starting it I finally just said, you know what? I'm just going to put one out. I kind of follow that Tim Ferriss thought process. It's like I kind of scratched my own itch. So I'm like, I want to talk to people. That'd be cool. And it turned into one of the best things that I have ever done in many ways. And I've said it a couple of times, but it really sort of saved my soul in a lot of ways because I'm sort of at that point in my career where I'm almost ready to retire from EMS. And I was missing something that was truly a passion for me. And the podcast has become that. So it's been it's saved my soul in a lot of ways. It's the best way I can think to put it.
Yeah. No, I similar story for me, and I've told this once or twice on the podcast, so excuse me if repeat listeners are annoyed by this by now. But
Yeah.
I during COVID, man, I was a traveling consultant for 7 or 8 years, always
Yeah.
on airplanes. A lot of times on my way back from a client site, I would just strike up conversations with people that have an interesting book or they look interesting. I was going to find out about their grandkids is how I normally say it. Like,
Yeah.
talk to me about life. Like, let's do this. And I got a lot of value out of that. Some people kind of roll their eyes at the curious traveler, but like for
Yeah.
me, like I got a window into somebody else's world,
Yes.
as random as a slot machine pull. Like, don't know who I'm
Yep.
sitting next to, don't know what this is going to be about. And it's I didn't usually do it go into a client site, but usually coming back, I'd have a beer or two.
Yeah.
And then like, let's talk if you're willing to talk. Sometimes it was a miss, but
Yes.
that part of me started to atrophy the first 9-10 months
Yeah.
into COVID. And
I get that.
I really needed to go out and seek and to information. I've gotten so many great books. I've gotten so many awesome
Yes.
stories. I get to meet really cool people and shift my perspective. And like, I feel like if
Yeah.
I'm just stagnant, I'm dying.
Yes. Yep. Yep. As Ed
Absolutely.
Calderon says, stillness is death.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. So I'm heads down, like going into it. And it's, again, like you, it's off the side of my desk for the most
yeah.
part, but what an important thing it is in my life.
Yeah, it's amazing, man. And I can totally relate to that because the more I started talking to people I already knew, and then, but then I started learning things that people already knew. I'm like, I had no idea some of the things that, that there had, culminated in, us coming together in this podcast. And I'm like, holy shit, I had no idea. And that's what's been fascinating. I interviewed my mom not long ago, and that was one of the most amazing things because she's 84 now and she doesn't speak as eloquently as she wants to. Well, she says she doesn't. I think she does still, right? But she's still sharp as a whip. And just what she experienced in her life and becoming a leader, she really was a role model for me in like leadership versus management. And that's why I get so passionate about leadership, and so it's interesting, like talking to her, like, I've known my mom all my life, right? But it's interesting hearing these stories, from her day and just seeing that look in her eye, when she recalls these events. Absolutely amazing, man. But it's like that with a lot of people I get to talk to. Again, talking to you now is absolutely. I'm always amazed when someone wants to have me on the podcast because I'm like, what am I going to tell you? I'm the one asking questions, right?
Oh yeah, I feel that way as well. But I mean, I think what happens is you put out a net and start collecting perspectives, and
Yeah.
you are able to distill down the fine points of somebody's experience and apply it to your own life and get experience around it. Like, you do become like somebody who has at least a few things to say or to offer conversationally,
Yeah.
as opposed to like, I would be scared if there was anyone out there that was like, I really, really am going to listen to Jake moving forward. He's my guy. I'm like, well, hold on. Why don't you go temper that with, people who have written books or are much more educated than I am on how to do this thing called life. But, certainly I'd love to introduce people to interesting folks like you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man.
The other thing that I wanted to talk about, in having such a distinguished savage like yourself on the podcast is
Sweet talker, you.
we are in a time in history right now that's super interesting. There are a lot of angry, coddled children on both sides of the political spectrum that are insane keyboard warriors and trolls. We have a generation that adopted technology late, that gets, constantly pulled into the craziness. I think that there's like, in my opinion, there's like two groups of people, like the over 60 crowd and the under 25 crowd, that creates so much chaos on the internet. Now that's not completely true, but I would say like, Pareto, about 80% of it is coming from people with time, people who are early in their life experience and people who have something to say because they're later in their life experience. And it's just constantly at odds. And I feel like, we're trained by technology to get up in arms at the slightest little thing. And, how does someone like yourself, who's had a lot of these conversations with leaders and great people, how do you view this right now? Like the time that we're in, the way that people are acting, and, maybe is there a suture to put on some of this?
Man, oh my God, that's a huge question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I think for the first time in my adult life, I'm concerned about the direction that we're taking as a nation, I guess, because sort of exactly what you're saying, man, this divisiveness that we have it blows my mind. I miss those days when we're like, well, like we're all going to figure it out. Let's kind of get that shared positive outcome, and it doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And that blows my mind. And the lack of this complete abandonment of critical thinking skills really freaks me out. And I think you're right, man. So much people want to get they get their information from like this one place, or they live in an echo chamber, and they're like, this is what, especially that cancel culture thing is really blows my mind. It's like, well, you don't believe what I believe, so you shouldn't be able to say what you believe at all. And I'm like, dude, where are we going with all this? I think technology has really, to say the least, exponentiated that in many ways, because it's so easy, with the algorithms, to get in your own echo chamber. Like, oh, if you like this, you would like this, follow this person or follow this organization. And man, I like to get a little bit of everything, right? Because I'm very laissez-faire, and two, but I'm very middle of the road. I'm agnostic about a lot of things. I have a few things that are important to me. I probably lean more conservative than anything, but I'm not averse to like other ways of thinking. I want to have a discourse, a logical, reasonable discourse and dialogue about it. And man, that has seemed to go out the window. And it freaks me out, because to answer your question of like, a suture in that, I don't know right now, because even for me, I am careful about some of the things I say on the podcast, because I still have a day job, right, with an EMS system, a large metropolitan system. And they're, even with like coworkers, I got to be kind of careful, because for me, again, I'm laissez-faire, right? I think more like, well, in the vaccine thing, right? I think if you want to get it, you should get it. If you don't want to get it, I don't think you should be mandated.
100%.
Yeah. And I just, you kind of look at it from a very like middle of the road, reasonable point of view. And then so I have to kind of be careful with some coworkers, because, as soon as I say, well, I don't think it should be mandated, like, you don't believe in science. And I'm like, okay, first and foremost, that is a horrible, that's just a red herring argument, right? What are we doing here? But a lot of times it's people love to dig their heels in on beliefs. And I read Robert Anton Wilson's Prometheus Rising about 11 years ago, and it sort of changed my perspective. So one of the things that he said was like, I don't have beliefs, I have ideas, because ideas are a lot easier to change than beliefs are in light of new evidence. And I really like that thought process. So I don't try to go down this like, this is this and it'll never change kind of a situation, right? I'm like, well, you know what, this is what I think is the most reasonable thing now, and if something changes that is new evidence, then, and to me that's more scientific than just going, well, CNN told me that there should be a mandate, or like it's bizarre to me right now, man. I'd be curious what your thoughts on it are, because is there a fix, or where are we headed?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm a little lost on this one as well, where it's how do you unweave something into the fabric of an individual? I don't know. And that's what people are prescribing to, I think, right now in a lot of ways. I think it's going to be like, I'm waiting for the era of time when the bubble bursts on this and it's the great disappointment. Maybe that's what we can call it, where we realize
Yeah.
that all of these people, whether it be celebrities or politicians or business leaders, the majority of them are full of shit about most of the things that they put out there. There's a handful
You're
of people who
speaking to
are,
my soul right now.
there's a handful of people that are truly living the values.
Yeah.
And as long as we're willing to character assassinate people with good character, we're going to have a hard time. And
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
how do you start giving people the benefit of the doubt when you can only find the negative in who they are and what they do because they don't align with you politically? I mean, would you rather have someone that you disagree with politically, but operates at a high standard with a moral compass? Or would you rather have somebody who's shady as all fuck
Yeah.
that is, on your side of the political aisle?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of people that would pick the latter in that. And
sadly, I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's just this weird, just burn it all down mentality. I don't understand that, because I'm like, hey, look, like at some point we're all going to have to live together. We have to figure this shit out together.
Yeah.
So, like maybe just torching everything is not the best idea. It's really weird, man. It's and I think there's so many confluences coming in that are sort of making, I think social media drives it. I mean, there's a large amount of money to be made on divisiveness, and clickbait, and there's a large amount of, not to sound too conspiratorial, but there's a large amount of power that can be gained by pressing people towards one narrative or another, whatever that narrative is, whether it's left or right or wherever it is. And that frightens me too, because I'm like, why are we pushing narratives? Why can't we just all jump on the home team, come for the big win?
Well, I think the thing that I struggle with in that space, and I've been victim of going down too deep into a rabbit hole sometimes, and I don't get to the point where I'm like, birds aren't real. If you've seen that hashtag lately, birds are not a real thing. They're just surveillance devices. I'm like, all right. It's a little,
I haven't seen that, but that's amazing.
That's a little far from me. I almost bought a hat that said birds aren't real just because I thought it was hilarious. But
that is funny.
I think that it's hard to deny that there's something going on. Like, of course, when you have billionaire business people and you have easily influenced political leaders, there's inherently some shady shit going on. To what extent that shady shit is, how wide the breadth is, how deep the depth of it is, like that's all the stuff that's up for debate. There's just a sense, an overwhelming sense, and I would say in the majority of the population, that there is something that's amiss here. This does not feel right.
No.
And so when you have that feeling, but then anytime you try to follow a hunch, like there's a whole half the population that's like, don't even go there. You're an idiot for going there. You're like, I just want to see what this is. Like, I
just want to understand.
Yeah. And then there's some people who just get sucked into it and all of a sudden birds aren't real. So, I don't know. And I think I'm suspect of people who everything they talk about is a conspiracy theory. I'm also suspect of people who don't believe there's any conspiracies.
I know. I'm the same way, man. Like with everything, I'm so middle of the road, and you have to kind of be careful who you talk to about it, because some people are like, oh, you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist. And I'm like, I remember when saying there's going to be vaccine passports was going to be as a conspiracy theory, and now, oh, they're real. So it's weird, man. It's an odd time. It's heady days, and I'm not always sure. It's a little it's very off balancing for me, because people who I formerly liked and respected, talk about some of the craziest things, whether it's like super far left or super far right. But it's weird to me that like friends of mine, I think the mandate's kind of a slippery slope for like mandating a whole lot of other things, right? It's weird, I've like had friends who work in the medical industry like, well, if you're not getting the mandate, I'm not going to treat you. And I'm like, hold on a minute, you didn't have a problem with the with the lung cancer guy who smoked, or the drunk driver who, who drank and drove and injured himself. You didn't have any problem with that. But now, why is this one particular narrative the
Yeah.
thing? And that's been really weird to me in the medical community. It's interesting how it's really went from like this medical thing to this huge political football that is just massive. It went so much further than I thought it would, as far as a whipping post, maybe. I don't know. Like, it's hard to, like, or as at least as a political football that's being bandied about.
Yeah. Yeah. There's like and this is not a well-formed thought, but I'm going to just throw it out here anyway. It's just like individual responsibility, I think, is the catalyst for the answer to the problem. Right.
Yes.
So if we look inward and we say, okay, what am I
Oh,
truly responsible for? How am I carrying myself? How am I treating others? Am I leading with gratitude? Am I serving others well? Am I creating gravity around me of positivity? And I'm going to introduce that into my life. And as other people introduce that into their lives, great. But then there's this spectrum as well of, I don't want to use the word injustice. That's such a polarizing term. There are people getting the short end of the stick in areas of life.
sure.
Right.
Sure.
And I think that when you have an individual responsibility to seeing the good in the world and trying to perpetuate good in the world, that hopefully you see those people as well, and you can find ways to make impact in them. Where I start to lose this is when we like take opinions that people have. Like, it's your responsibility to formulate an opinion about something.
Yeah.
It's not your responsibility to hold the same opinion about something, or hold the same opinion as a collective. But
Yeah.
you should be formulating opinions about stuff. And it's also your responsibility of going out and asking questions and being curious if you want to participate in society in a positive, meaningful way. And to chastise people for having opinions that you don't agree with, like, I just don't know how we undo that part. Because you can have as much like personal responsibility as you want, but when you venture out in the world and you're like, oh, hey, I'm pro Second Amendment, and I believe that because people should have a right to defend themselves, and people should have the right to carry firearms with themselves, and you go down this path, and then somebody just disagrees with you, and now you're a terrible person.
Yeah.
I don't know how we undo that. I don't know what the bridge is. It's perplexing for me.
Yeah. And I don't know how, I think for me, I don't know how you get there either. Right. Because it's so foreign to me. If someone thinks differently to me, I can think, well, that's crazy. Why would they think that? But by the same token, I'm like, there's something, some logic or some reasoning or some emotion that has driven that viewpoint. Right. And so who am I to say, well, that's wrong, or it's just because it's different from mine? But man, I think you're absolutely on point. I think that it seems to me that personal responsibility has kind of gone out the window recently, right? Like, I feel like everything has become more self-centric. We've sort of this point and click society now where everything is you can sit behind a keyboard and like shitbag people, which I don't get. And and you're right, man. It's just like this vitriolic just blast of that people do. It blows my mind, and I don't get that, whether it's in person, whether it's online. I every once in a while get some snarky comment on my Instagram. I'm like, this guy, like, I'm like, it's like, you took the time just to comment on something that's not even germane to what I even posted. That's just weird to me. It's interesting, man. But I think, again, you're hitting the nail on the head in that. I think it comes down to people taking more personal responsibility for like, whatever you believe is what you believe, but have a reasonable, or have some sort of research behind it.
Yeah.
Right. And but take responsibility for that, and understand that other people may not believe what you believe. That's what makes us all different.
Yeah. And maybe there were periods of time where we could, and maybe as a society, get away with outsourcing some of our perspectives and moral compass to leaders that we believe in. I think right now it's time to insource. It's time to bring that back domestically in your heart. And it's time. We're in a cycle where you're really going to have to do some due diligence, and you're really going to have to be patient in forming a perspective. And you're really going to have to understand that there's people out there who want you to believe certain things because it helps them sell whatever laundry detergent on TV, or like the incentives are not to tell the truth right now. There's just none.
Yeah,
There's no
I
incentive
know.
structure to do that.
That blows my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that's sort of it. I always kind of think of myself as this lovable, hopeful misanthrope, where I'm like,
It's lovable.
I feel like, yeah, like lovable and hopeful misanthrope, right? It's just this weird,
Yeah.
dichotomy of like, I'm like, oh, we're just all doomed, but I'm like, but maybe we'll all pull it together at the last minute,
Yeah.
And it's so much like that, man. It's bizarre to me. Again, with the biggest thing to me is like this lack of critical thinking. It's like you see something and and I get that initial emotional sort of like, what, I can't believe this occurred, and I'm like, one of the things I have I have in the laundry room, and one of the door to the water heater I painted with chalkboard paint, and then big chalk letters I wrote, "Don't believe everything you think," right? Because I never want to have that emotional, you can have that emotional visceral reaction, but then you got to temper it with some like, okay, well, is that really real, or is that just something I read? Because
Yeah.
I mean, you see a lot of money, power, and traffic driven to specific narratives. And that's what freaks me out too. Like whether it's a narrative I believe in or not, right? It kind of weirds me out when people kind of get driven that way, like sort of like cattle. That kind of freaks me out. I'm like, make an informed decision, So I don't know, man.
Well, and it's hard to, especially if you watch, cult documentaries or things like that. You watch like Johannesburg, for instance, and things like that. Like the human brain is malleable. It's extremely malleable, and it does not take much to get somebody slanted in a direction that they will do things that they never, ever thought imaginable 6 months prior. And it just takes persistence, and it takes reinforcement, and it takes like this optimism or this alignment for this greater good or this state. And you watch all these great, these, I don't want to say great leaders, but you want to see these leaders throughout history that hypnotized people verbally and then reinforced physically. There's not a great track record for it. It's just not.
Yeah, it's free. Have you seen that Netflix documentary? It's I think it's called what, Playbook of a Tyrant, or
I haven't.
Something to that effect. They kind of document how these different tyrants, like oh, this is how you do it. This is like like Hitler, Mussolini, Idi Amin, all these different tyrants, and it's got some scary correlations to kind of what's going on now. And I'm like, does anybody else see what's going on right now? It's like, and that's the thing is like I don't know what I don't know, but things seem uneasy and quirky to me right now. So
yeah,
I mean, I don't know, man.
Hey, brother, I've got one more canned question that I had for you before you came on the podcast, which was, I love your tagline. You're, define, defend, defy. What's that all about? Help me understand.
So, when I first was thinking about this, I wanted to think about like, what is the essence of, my whole thing was like, I want to put something in the world that, hopefully people are going to listen to, or like at least scratch my own itch. And that I've always had this deep belief in, like, you should have that sovereign right to defend yourself. Right. But I also think that you should always have, again, a sovereign right to define who you are, what you are, like define your own narrative. I heard Jamie Foxx on Tim Ferriss's podcast once say, don't let anybody define your narrative for you. And I'm thinking, that's incredible. And the defy is, man, there's always been this, as much as I've worked in, whether it's federal, state or local government, I always have this, I'm always a bit defiant, because I'm not just a go along, get along guy. I'm not a conformist. I'm kind of my own guy. And so that defend, define, defy thing was like, I want to define who I am. I'm going to defy the norm, and I'm going to defend my right. And whether it's physically or verbally or just being me, amongst like everyone else saying, "Ah, you're crazy," right? I'm going to sort of, like Emerson said, speak with words as hard as cannonballs, even if it contradicts what you said the day before. That's sort of my whole thought process. It's how I kind of live my life, much to the chagrin of a lot of people, because I think I get misunderstood a lot, which is interesting. I always feel like I'm a UFO that touches down and people are like, I don't know what to make of this guy. Right? And so that's where that whole thought process came from, especially on the defy part. And I personified that. And we both have a lot of ink, right? I have a huge Maori, the warrior face with the pukana, the outstretched tongue.
Yeah. Oh,
which is
yeah.
a symbol of defiance, right? It's like the majority of my lower back is the outstretched tongue, and that was sort of because everything I have ink wise, has some sort of meaning specific, and
Yeah.
has some sort of attachment to a time in my life, or a thought process, or a philosophy,
Is it,
that kind of thing. So
is it like Sean Brady's back? Have you seen Sean Brady in the UFC?
no,
He's
no, I haven't
got,
seen his
man,
back.
Sean Brady's got like a giant, it's like this red looking devil face with the
Oh,
outstretched tongue on it.
that's awesome.
It's,
Yeah, it is like that then. Yeah, it's
it's,
just all black.
yeah, it's badass, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, man.
Sean is 15-0 welterweight.
Damn it.
And yeah, he's doing great, man. He's getting after it. And certainly shout out to Few Will Hunt, sponsor of this podcast, sponsor
Yeah,
Sean,
yeah.
Sean as well. So excited to continue to watch his career progress as well. Hey, brother, we're wrapping up here. Where do people
Yeah, man.
find you? And go and hit that subscribe button. This guy's got a ton of awesome podcasts that you need to listen
Oh, I
to. So,
appreciate
Walt,
that.
where do people find you, and any parting words?
Man. So the podcast it's on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify. It's on Audible, on Amazon Music, on all the major platforms. You can find me. Usually, I have a Twitter, which is TDSATX, all caps. Rarely on there, honestly. Instagram's a big place to find me, the Distinguished Savage. And I have a Facebook, but I get on Facebook once a week, and I'm like, oh, and I turn around and get back off
Oh,
again.
yeah.
Yeah, I joke about, like every episode that there's a website coming. There is a website and a blog coming, right? I'm getting ready. I've got a friend of mine helping me put that together and getting that all cooking, right? So I've had a lot of other things sort of trying to get to pan out. So that's going to be the next big push, is actually getting a website and a blog series, especially on dressing, because it's hard to find guys who are in the tactical world and who try to dress well too, right? So,
Yeah.
and Craig Douglas was a big one. I have a guy coming on. I just did the ECQC class with Craig Douglas's class, who lives here in Austin, who has a company called Black Tactical ATX. He's going to be coming on. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, man, the Distinguished Savage on Instagram is the main place to find me. Or if people want to reach out via email, walt@thedistinguishedSavage.com, world's longest website name. But you can find the podcast pretty much anywhere.
Well, Walt, man, honored to have you on the podcast, my friend. It's one of those things that I've been looking forward to for a while, following you for a while.
Man, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, for sure, man. And again, I absolutely love your logo. People should go check it out. Go find the Distinguished Savage out there on Instagram. Give Walt's podcast a listen. And thanks for joining us for our conversation. All right, cheers.